Hi, my name is Casey Walker. I'm an attorney and I'm the founder of VA Disability Group. Today, we're going to be talking about generalized anxiety disorder. Incidentally, it gives me a little bit of anxiety to do this type of public speaking, so there you have it. Maybe I have a diagnosis. But let's dig into generalized anxiety disorder. The VA has a diagnosis they will accept found in the DSM-5, which is the mental health manual that practitioners must give diagnosis through. That's called generalized anxiety disorder. And anxiety itself can also be a symptom of other conditions. So let's break those two out. One's a symptom. You can have anxiety and be diagnosed with PTSD because anxiety can be a symptom of PTSD. You can have anxiety and be diagnosed with depression. But here we're talking about the actual diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Let's break that out. What does that mean? Well, the VA relies on the DSM-5's requirements for how to diagnose generalized anxiety disorder. Specifically, I'm going to go straight to the DSM and what's needed for a diagnosis. Generalized anxiety disorder is a distinct diagnosis found in the DSM with the following requirements. Number 1, excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. Number 2, the person finds it difficult to control the worry. Number 3, the anxiety and worry are associated with 3 or more of the following 6 symptoms. And then they break out these random 6 things. Restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbances. Then after we move on from that element, move on to the next element, which is the disturbance is not better explained by another mental health disorder. And then next, the anxiety, worry, or physical symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And then lastly, the disturbance is not attributable to the psychological effects of a substance or another medical condition. So are we abusing drugs, alcohol? So those are the requirements. So in order for a practitioner to come to the determination that someone has generalized anxiety disorder, those are the elements they're going to walk through. It's required because they have to practice with the DSM. Now, I provided a link in the description that breaks out the nuances and differences between the old DSM-4, which changed in 2013, to the DSM-5. And these are the practitioner's requirements in order to assess and determine whether someone has generalized anxiety disorder. You can take a look for yourself there to see if you think you still have generalized anxiety disorder, or if you might have it today. So why would a veteran want to claim generalized anxiety disorder? I mean, you've got so many different types of mental health conditions. You got PTSD, you got depression, you got anxiety, you got phobias, you got all kinds of conditions. Well, it's a generic one, and you see it diagnosed quite often. But the most common mental health condition that veterans tend to claim is PTSD. But here's the problem with PTSD. Not all veterans had a stressor on active duty. And in order to claim PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, you need to be able to point to a stressor on active duty. Now, if that stressor wasn't from combat, the evidentiary burden becomes quite high. You got to demonstrate that it actually happened. Whereas combat, by virtue of the nature of combat itself, it's conceded that there's a stressor. So I bring this is a long-winded way of saying that sometimes you can't claim the easier PTSD with the less evidentiary burden. So something like a generalized anxiety disorder might be the better approach for you. Perhaps you have an underlying condition that your service connected with. Maybe it's back, maybe it's migraines. And sometimes those conditions can cause secondary conditions. And maybe it causes anxiety. Maybe your headaches, or you're never sure if you're going to get one of these extreme headaches, or maybe you have bad vertigo. Maybe you start having anxiety going out in public because you become incapacitated in public and it's embarrassing. So that would be another way that generalized anxiety disorder might be a superior claim to, say, PTSD if you didn't have a stressor. So let's talk about how is generalized anxiety disorder evaluated by the VA. Before we get into this, remember that the first objective is you have to get service connection. So we're about to discuss the evaluation or the symptoms. First things first, you have to be diagnosed and you have to be service connected. We already walked through the diagnosis criteria, but you have to be service connected. Once you're service connected, then we move on to what's your evaluation. Show me the money. What's the percentage assigned? So let's talk about that. We're going to look at 38 CFR 4.130. This is commonly referred to as the rating schedule. And in the rating schedule, they break out the mental health symptoms. And as you can see, there's a litany of different symptoms. But the breakdown, if you really summarize this, is occupational and social impairment. occupational and social impairment. You'll notice they have 0, 10, 30, 50, 70, and 100% evaluations. There is no 80 and there is no 90. So if you have a 70% evaluation, be careful, because the next evaluation could go up to 100, which might be good, but they might find you incompetent. So 70%, if you're sitting there, don't try to get the 80 or 90 because it doesn't exist. If you have the 50, don't go for the 60 because it doesn't exist. But what does social and occupational impairment mean? Well, when you're talking, let's talk about social impairment. Well, maybe you've gotten 3 divorces in the last 10 years, and you're struggling to maintain a relationship with your spouse. Maybe your kids have lost contact with you, and you have no desire to talk to them. Maybe you're perpetually fighting with your neighbors. Maybe your coworkers have kind of shunned you because you're always aggressive or frustrated. Maybe you're going to church and you're having conflict at church or whatever religious facility you might go to. Maybe you're perpetually going to counseling with your significant other or people who are important to you in your life. So those would be examples of social impairments. And now let's talk about occupational impairments. Well, maybe you are, yet again, you're fighting with your coworkers. That's an occupational impairment because no employer wants their employees fighting in the workplace. Maybe you're perpetually being given remedial training or additional training for the same thing over and over and over again. This is really demonstrating that you're not a sustainable employee. Perhaps you're constantly calling in sick and missing a lot of work because your anxiety is just so bad. Or maybe you have an inability to focus on the job and you find yourself, you gotta write a contract up and you just find yourself staring at the computer for multiple days. So those would be examples of occupational impairment. But it's looking at the totality of both social and occupational impairment. It's not just because you find something in the 50% range doesn't mean you're going to be stuck with a 50% evaluation, or just because you have something in the 70% range. There's a little bit of overlap in all these degrees of impairment. The adjudicator's job is to look at the totality of evidence and to try to determine which evaluation best fits the veteran's case. So let's segue from the symptoms found in the rating schedule to the actual disability benefits questionnaire, commonly referred to as a DBQ. This is the actual report that examiners, whether it be a VA contracted examiner or if you bring the DBQ, which is a form that's public facing, meaning you can print it and bring it to an examiner yourself, they both are going to go through the same criteria. So let's walk through that criteria and look at the important aspects of this form. The DBQ we're looking at today is mental disorders, and notably it's other than PTSD and eating disorders. So this is just a generic, all other mental health conditions fall under this DBQ. PTSD has its own criteria, eating disorders have their own criteria. We're not talking about those. We're talking about generalized anxiety disorders. And that condition would be found and assessed based on the mental disorders DBQ. So with that in mind, let's take a look. First, let's look at the section 1, which is going to break down the diagnosis. When you're looking at the diagnosis, that diagnosis must come from the DSM-5. We have a separate video on that. It's in the description. So take a look at that. But the diagnosis must come from the DSM-5. It's incumbent on the veteran to the extent possible to try to get examiners to maintain the same diagnosis. And the reason for this is when you go to section 1, number 2, it talks about differentiation of symptoms, and it expressly states, does the veteran have more than one mental health disorder diagnosed? Why is this relevant? Well, if you have 2 or 3 mental health disorders that have been diagnosed, and you're only service-connected with one of them, the VA could weaponize symptoms attributable to these other diagnoses and say those are only attributable to those conditions for which you're not service-connected. Therefore, your symptoms aren't as severe as we thought because they're attributable to conditions that you're not service-connected with. So I hope that makes sense, but you only want to pursue things you're service-connected for. And so if you only have one diagnosis and you're service-connected with that, you avoid all that type of scrutiny. Now, in most cases, I would say about 75 to 80% of the time, the examiner is going to say that in number 2B there, is it possible to differentiate what symptoms are attributable to each diagnosis? The overwhelming majority of the time, maybe even 95% of the time, they check no, because there's so much overlap in mental health symptoms. So they check no, and when they check no, that means it's not going to be held against you if you have more than one mental health diagnosis. So moving from there, let's take a look at number 3. So we're in section 1, number 3, occupational and social impairment. Now, you're going to find that this comes directly from the rating schedule and the criteria that we just looked at, straight from 38 CFR Part 4, which is the disability evaluations based on social and occupational impairment. Guys, this is the box, this is the section that the adjudicators run with. If you could summarize this whole form on one number. It's number 3, and it's what box they check. And each one of those boxes corresponds 100, 70, 50, 30, 10, and 0% disability evaluation. So sometimes these adjudicators or decision makers get a little lazy. They don't look at the totality of evidence. They go straight to this box and say, what did the examiner check? And that's what they give you. I would say that happens about 80% of the time. So this box, if you're going to bring a DBQ to your examiner and say, hey, would you fill this out for me? And just go straight to that box. Make sure they check that box, the one that you think you're eligible for. Because if they check something less, the adjudicator is going to rely on something you have procured and given to the VA against you. So number 3 is critical. Let's move on to Section 2. One specific spot on Section 2 of this DBQ, evidence reviewed. If the examiner checks no records were reviewed, most judges aren't going to lend any probative value to this assessment. Similarly, if a VA compensation and pension examiner checks no records were reviewed, no probative value should be assigned to this. Now, what you have happen is if you procure the examination from a private practitioner, the VA will weaponize that against you. But what you commonly see is if the VA compensation and pension examiner checks no records reviewed, they don't even look at it. And that's a big problem. Now, another consideration there is if they check records reviewed, they're either lying or they reviewed the records. And one easy way is sometimes the examiner will write records not made available to me. So they'll check that they reviewed the records, but then they'll say records not made available to me. Well, we have a discrepancy here. This is a big issue, and all credibility has been lost. So if it's an unfavorable report, you call that out. If it's a favorable report, you don't call it out. Moving on from there, let's take a look at Section 3. And here we have the symptoms. Now, what you're going to see, if you go back to the rating schedule that we previously looked at, found in the regulation at 4.130, 38 CFR 4.130, these symptoms are verbatim. They're coming directly from the regulation. And so these aren't just flippant random symptoms that a bunch of practitioners said, let's throw anxiety on there. Maybe suspiciousness, that's a common one. These are straight from the regulation. That's why they're here. Now, if an examiner checks that you have total occupational and social impairment, putting you in 100% realm, and they only check anxiety, they only check one of these things, that doesn't add up. And if an adjudicator is doing their job properly, they're going to say, well, it's great that they checked the 100% box, but the symptoms aren't there because these boxes weren't checked. It's a box checking game. You got to check the box. So if you have severe symptoms, make sure the boxes are checked. If you have suicidal ideation at times, if you want to hurt someone at times, those boxes should be checked. If you have difficulty with memory, check that box. But the important aspect here, though, is that you don't leave these boxes unchecked. Something has to be checked. So let's move on to Section 6. Now, I'm trying to hit the high points of this DBQ. We're still talking about generalized anxiety disorder. When you go down to Section 6, every VA mental health exam, an examiner must determine whether the veteran is competent. So sometimes you have people who have dementia, and dementia is a mental health condition found in the DSM. It's not uncommon that someone with severe dementia is incompetent. And when you have that competency determination, and the examiner says no, that you are not competent and capable of managing your financial affairs, the VA is going to propose to find you incompetent. And that's powerful. You don't want that. You don't want that. Every time there's 100% determination, extra scrutiny is given to a veteran to determine whether they're competent. So this box 6, if they check no, meaning you're not competent to handle your financial affairs, you might lose the ability to handle your financial assets. You'll have a fiduciary appointed over you, and they'll essentially babysit your finances. You lose a little bit of freedom. You lose a lot of freedom. So just be careful if you're pursuing that 100%. That's something that could be looked at a little bit more with a little bit more scrutiny. So that's the DBQ. I hope you found this helpful walking through the specific pages and sections of the DBQ. Let's talk about unique considerations of generalized anxiety disorder. When you file a mental health claim, file it broadly. Don't put yourself in a box. Don't just put generalized anxiety disorder. Don't diagnose yourself, and don't put yourself in a box with one diagnosis. Instead, when you make the initial claim, call it mental health with anxiety, depression, and PTSD, or anxiety, depression, and what other symptom you want to add there. But you're given a broad scope, mental health, so you're claiming all mental health conditions. Every once in a while, the VA will say, well, you claim PTSD and you have generalized anxiety disorder, so you don't get that effective date of the PTSD. Or you didn't claim generalized anxiety disorder, so we're not even going to consider it. That would be an injustice, and that would be a poor decision, but it still happens. So claim mental health broadly. Number 2, for unique considerations, is don't embellish. If you go into a mental health exam And let's say you're a nuclear engineer, or you have a really good job, or you have a job just in general. Don't go in there saying that you can't remember who the current president is. Don't go in there saying that you don't know how to count from 10 to 0 backwards. Or don't embellish, because you're going to lose all credibility, and the examiner will note it, and then the adjudicator will not want to give you a single thing, not just on your mental health claim, but on all claims. But also, don't be a tough guy, so just be a straight shooter. Make sure you're telling them about the severe symptoms you have throughout the month, and maybe if you're even having a good day, don't be a tough guy. Let them know about the bad days too. Another one is, don't offer too much information on traumatic events before the military or after the military. It's not uncommon people talk about severely traumatic things or disturbing things that happened to them before they went on active duty. Well, what the examiner or mental health practitioner is often going to do is they're going to ascribe any current diagnosis to those former events that predate your active duty. That's a bad thing, because your goal is to convince the examiner that you have a condition attributable to active duty. So I'm not saying to lie, but you also don't want to lend too much information that could be weaponized against you, especially if you know it's not attributable, that your current mental health symptoms aren't attributable to maybe a dog dying before you went on active duty, or your sister dying, or maybe your father got cancer and it's really traumatic. Don't offer it. If they ask you, did your father get cancer before you went on active duty? Well, the answer would be yes, but just don't lift it up. The goal is to minimize things before active duty, and then if some traumatic things happen after active duty, maybe try to minimize those as well, and focus on things on active duty or conditions that your service connected with that might cause a mental health condition. Lastly, be likable. Don't be a chotch. Just be likable. It's a golden rule. If you're nice to someone, they're going to want to be nice back. These examiners know that they hold the key to your examination report and to your evaluation. Just be nice. Be likable, and you're more likely to get a favorable report. It's just basic common sense. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you found this helpful. If you like this video, like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Comment below. Have a good day.